a good opening. Although I'm not sure this still works, so I'm still going to be a bit hamstrung here, I think. So that music, you're probably all familiar with it, the Pearl and Dean theme tune, this sort of Proustian Madeline for those of us who like to spend our time inside watching movies. I'm sure it conjures up lots of memories for you. If you do have any memories of these cinemas that we are going to be talking about, I'd love to hear them in the Q&A. I'll also be around all day for a chat if you want to talk about those. So I've been obsessed with film since I was very young. This is my first ever cinema ticket to see Superman 2 when I was 4 years old. And today, among other things, one way that I explore that interest in film is through these walking tours that John mentioned about the history of cinemas and cinema going in London. Let's see if this actually works. Oh, this is ridiculous. We're going to struggle here. Basically, the slides have got a life of their own. So here I am. This is in front of the Odeon Leicester Square. This cinema was opened in 1937 by Odeon's founder, Oscar Deutsch, in 1937. So I'll be talking more about Oscar Deutsch later. And the other way that I look at London cinema history is through this website called Memory Palaces, hence the name of the talk. And since films were first shown in London in 1896, Hackney has been home to more than 60 cinemas. And as we'll see later, there were dozens of other venues showing films in these early years. This is a map from a great little book called The Cinemas and Theatre of Hackney by Gavin McGrath. And it shows just how many cinemas we've had in the borough over the years. And if you're not local, you need a little bit of a... This is roughly where we are now at the Round Chapel. So I think the little laser thing works. So no, I'm not going to bother with any of the technology. So if you look at the north, there's a huge cluster of cinemas along Stoke Newington High Street down into Dalston, another large group around Mare Street, and more where we are now in Clapton. Not time to talk about all of them, but what I hope to do is tell the history of more than 100 years of cinema going generally through the stories of some of the cinemas that we have had in Hackney. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and hopefully we should have time for questions and chat afterwards. So broadly, we're going to be going through this history chronologically. We're going to start the story not at a cinema, but at a theatre. I'm sure many of you have sat in this auditorium. So the Hackney Empire was designed by the legendary architect Frank Matcham. You'll know a lot of his other theatres, the Colosseum on St Martin's Lane, the London Palladium, the Hippodrome in Leicester Square, and that's just a few. In his career, he designed more than 90 theatres. The Empire opened in December 1901, so less than 6 months after London's first ever public film screening took place. That took place here at what is now the Regent Street Cinema. It's just down the road from the BBC at Broadcasting House. It's now part of the University of Westminster. Back then, it was the Marlborough Hall in the Royal Polytechnic. Many of you will have heard of these two gents, the Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis from Lyon in central France. So they'd shown films to a paying audience in Paris in December 1895. And in February 1896, 10 of their short films were shown at the Marlborough Hall on Regent Street. The Lumiere brothers weren't there themselves present, but their names as inventors and innovators and filmmakers were a huge draw. And they had an agent, this guy you can see at the bottom, a guy called Felician Truey. So he ran the show. He was this great showman, as well as being this sort of vaudevillian, magician, acrobat, just the guy you want to promote your new works. And one of the films that they showed there, arguably the first ever film comedy. This film, it's a chap watering plants in the garden. His friend stands on the hosepipe. Hilarity ensues. So films were now this hot new entertainment. At the Hackney Empire, short films became part of the sort of the music hall mix alongside the singers, comedians, and acrobats that you would have had there. So this is an advert from a 1907 edition of the invaluable Kinematograph and Lantern Weekly. So this is an advert for the Gaumont Company, film distributors. And here, under local subjects on the right, it says, on the afternoon of the 13th, we had the pleasure of taking the Hackney Horse and Cart Parade, which was shown at the Hackney Empire the same evening. And this is an advert, even better clipping, from the same journal from 1915. A good film was projected at the Hackney Empire last week. Audiences at music halls are generally prepared to leave when films are projected, but in the night of our visit, they stayed and loudly applauded, so well done. So the early years of cinema in Hackney, film is being shown kind of and enjoyed sort of alongside theatre and lots of other live entertainment. And I came across a passage from a book that's called That's the Way It Was, a working class autobiography, 1890 to 1950, by a guy called Walter Southgate. And it paints a really vivid picture of Hackney in this period. He writes, about the time that the Hackney Music Hall was opened, there still existed off the Hackney Road one of the last penny gaffs. And a penny gaff was almost like a sort of a storefront theatre, very, very basic, quite bawdy entertainment. And they started installing these sort of what the butler saw sort of peep shows in there, and then would later show projected film, hang up a sheet, or a whitewashed wall. So here he is continuing. Penny gaffs had largely disappeared by the 1900s, except the Belmonts, known locally as the Fleapit. It maintained the tradition of such places right to the very end, colourful, noisy, with melodrama and excitement. As the old Fleapit went out, so silent bioscope came in, with a juvenile audience enjoying the bloodletting, the shooting, and the thundering of horse hooves necessary in a Wild West film. There again, the appropriate noises and tempo had to be supplied by a versatile pianist. This fellow sat in the wings, playing the same tunes and making the same noises twice nightly, 7 days a week. So in addition to films being shown at music halls and these sort of makeshift shop conversions, they will also screen in what were called biograph tents. This is one on Hampstead Heath, the Queen's cinematograph. And that quote that I just read, Walter Southgate, I found that in a book by the cinema historian Luke McKernan. And Luke has estimated that between 1907 and 1914, 52 cinemas were established in Hackney. I mean, a staggering number. And he calls it a phase of greedy speculation in cinema building. And what prompted a lot of that development of these first purpose-built cinemas was a piece of legislation, the Cinematograph Act of 1909, essentially a piece of public health and safety law, and it required the provision of you had to have your a fire-resistant projection booth. Film at the time is very, very flammable celluloid nitrate, and also, stuff we take for granted. How about exit doors that actually open out onto the street? But that meant you now needed a license, and showing films in a tent or an old shop would not meet those legal requirements. So many of you be familiar with this corner of Mare Street near Hackney Central, the station. So this is what it looked like around 1915. Two cinemas next door to each other. On the left, you can see the Electric Palace Theatre. That opened in 1909 in a converted draper's shop. It closed in 1914 when the road there was widened. Next door, the one that is open in business, the Hackney Picture Palace, opened in 1911, closed by 1917. So like any sort of new industry, a lot of speculation, not always successful, sort of opportunistic development. So with the Cinematograph Act in place, more and more films are being produced from all over the world. It's a silent era. It doesn't matter where a film is made, you're going to be able to enjoy it, whatever. This sort of era sees these more and more impressive cinemas being built in Hackney. So I'm just going to talk about a few of them. So the Clapton Cinematograph Theatre opened in 1910. It was adapted from the function room of the pub next door, the White Hart, and where's Julia? I met her earlier. Hi, Julia at the front here. So Julia, I must thank Julia Lafferty from the Friends of the Clapton Cinematograph Theatre. She sent me these photos, and she also sent me this advert. This is for the cinema, and I'll zoom in so you can see it more clearly. So hopefully you get a sense of what the auditorium looked like, this sort of barrel-vaulted ceiling, just under 800 seats, all on one level. And then I love the fact it's advertised as Clapton's Popular Family Rendezvous. Sounds very wholesome. And at the bottom, you can see the prices. So it's likely that the cheaper seats would have been these quite basic benches, more expensive seats at the back, just tip up, none of which would have been, upholstered. And then you'll notice this phrase, continuous performance. In essence, you've got a show lasting about an hour of short films, about 5 minutes each in length, and you could stay as long as you like. Come in the middle, stay for 4 hours, it doesn't matter. The Castle Cinema, as we know it today, that opened in 2016, but the original cinema opened more than a century before and closed as a cinema in 1958. The Hoxton Cinema opened in 1914. This photograph is from a little bit later. You can see here, I Am Here Today. That's a little figure of Charlie Chaplin being advertised. And again, you see this continuous performance. And just to give you a sense of the changing era, this cinema was built on the site of the General Omnibus Stables. So that's what was here before. So it's this period, not just of new technology impacting entertainment, but also, horses are giving way to motorized transport in this period as well. And some of you may recognize the facade of this cinema. So the Curzon Hoxton, built on the same site in 2021, and although they didn't keep the original facade, they did recreate it. This magnificent cinema opened in 1914. The photograph is from about a decade or so later because this film, Souls in Exile, was released in 1926. And one of the lovely things that I found in the Hackney Archives were these handbills advertising a children's matinee in 1931 for what would have been Charlie Chaplin's brand new film, City Lights. I always think it's amazing to think about these legendary films, almost 100 years old, being brand new to audiences. I'm sure most of you are familiar, many of you are familiar with the Pizza Express opposite the Hackney Empire. Yeah? This is what was on that spot until it was demolished in 1972. So this is an era, the early 70s, before cinemas are becoming listed buildings, which is a shame because, as you can see, it was quite magnificent. Portland stone over brick. The foyer had a marble floor. That's what it looked like inside. It could seat over 1,200 people in the stalls and in the balcony, and the screen hidden behind beautiful velvet curtains. This cinema was bought in 1928 by a company called the Provincial Cinematograph Theatres, which had been founded in 1909. They were essentially Britain's first sort of national cinema chain. And I don't know if they had this in the pavilion, but I did find this picture online. This is Provincial Cinematograph Theatre's branded carpet, which somebody actually owns in their personal collection. Slightly envious. So there'd been a cinema on the site here since 1909. The Kingsland Palace of Animated Pictures. It had been converted from a shop, like a lot of these early cinemas. That was then demolished to make way for a cinema called the Kingsland Empire, designed by George Coles and Percy Adams. Another huge cinema, more than 1,000 seats. And George Coles, the architect, actually born in Dalston, so local. And this image isn't great. I'll show you this is the architect's drawing. And in 1937, this cinema was remodeled in an Art Deco style, and it is still here today. You could easily do a talk just about the Rio, and for probably many, many hours. So I'm not going to go too much into the Rio, but I will come back to it towards the end. This is another cinema designed by George Coles, even bigger than what became the Rio. This had 1,800 seats, but rather unusually, this is all on one level, so no balcony and stalls. And again, just take a look at how incredible the lobby looked like. And we're leaving the silent era with the Regent Stamford Hill, built by Provincial Cinematograph Theatres, who I mentioned earlier. And you can see that it's advertising this film, Al Jolson, The Singing Fool. So the film buffs among you, I'm sure, will know that Al Jolson's previous film, 1927, The Jazz Singer, usually considered the first talking picture. But the majority of people in this country would not have enjoyed this all singing, all dancing Jazz Singer, because most cinemas in Britain weren't installed for sound until 1929, 1930. So it's actually The Singing Fool, Al Jolson's follow-up, which is often the first talking picture that audiences in Britain would have seen. And the first film that they ever showed at the cinema in 1929 was quite a curio in this sort of transition period from silent to sound. This film called Street Angel, Frank Borzage, starring Janet Gaynor and Charles Farrell. And it had no dialogue, so it just had intertitles like you would get in a silent film, but it did have synchronized music and sound effects. So it was a sound picture, but with no talking. So this weird kind of transition period. So by the 1930s, some of these older cinemas built before World War I are starting to sort of feel a bit past their best. And the arrival of sound sparks a boom, both in terms of cinema audiences and new cinemas being built. And it's also a period when national cinema chains really dominate the market.
EC, the first Odeon. In this modern civilized age, Odeon has again become a household word, synonymous with everything that is perfect in entertainment. When Mr. Oscar Deutsch built his first theatre at Perry Bar, Birmingham, the name was reborn. And now there are Odeon theatres all over the country.
So Odeon is the only 1930s cinema chain whose name still lives on in the 21st century. And as we'll see, over the decades, Hackney had a handful of Odeon cinemas. So this is the Odeon's founder, Oscar Deutsch, who's born in Birmingham, son of Jewish immigrants from Hungary and Poland. And as you heard in the clip, the first Odeon in the country opened in a Birmingham suburb of Perry Bar in 1930. And he was an incredibly ambitious man. In 1936, he said he wanted an Odeon cinema in every town in Britain that had a population over 25,000. And that one way he achieved that goal was by buying up existing cinemas. And that's what he initially did in Hackney. So he purchased this cinema, that South Hackney Picture House, bought this in 1937, and it was occasionally would be advertised as the South Hackney Odeon, but it never got the full rebrand, and it was actually damaged in 1941 by bomb damage in World War II, and never reopened as a cinema. But that's also what Deutsch did with the Clapton Cinematograph Theatre that I showed you earlier. So one of these 1900s silent era cinemas. It had been renamed the Kenning Hall Cinema after the road nearby, and George Coles, who I mentioned earlier, designed a new modern Art Deco style facade and foyer. And Art Deco is really, I think, probably, when you're thinking about 1930s cinema, the sort of style that comes to mind, especially with these 1930s Odeons. Not a cinema in Hackney, this is the Odeon in Woolwich. But Hackney's very own George Coles did design this. It opened in 1937, and it is still standing. It is now an evangelical church. But I always think when you see cinemas like this, what it must have been like, 1930s, walking down these drab British high streets. I mean, it's as if some sort of spacecraft has landed. Hackney's new build Odeons were not quite as space age looking, but By 1938, when Odeon on Hackney Road opened, there were 300 Odeons in the country. So Deutsch had definitely met his goal there. Just by contrast, there's today about 100 Odeons in the country. The architect here, Andrew Mather, designed 10 other Odeons in his career. And this cinema had seating for almost 2,000 people. And like every other cinema in the country, really up until the 1970s, only one screen. This is an ad from the City and East London Observer announcing the opening of that cinema. And one of the great things about when you delve into local history archives, especially local papers, is sort of seeing what actually are the adjacent stories to what you are looking at. So this is a news clipping that I was reading about the opening of the cinema, but I was just really interested, just as an aside, this sort of little bit of news story next to it. So it's a letter from Mrs. D. Mitchell, Secretary of the Mile End West Ward Housewives Group, complaining that the Stepney ARP, their air raid precautions group, weren't training female volunteers. And she writes, Stepney is a densely populated area and its proximity to the docks makes it a favourable ground for air raids. So this is a couple of years before the war has started, 2 years before the Blitz, and I just think it was really interesting in this sort of pre-war period, getting a sense of what London was like. Oh dear. Okay. So this is the second Odeon new build in Hackney, also designed by Andrew Mather, opened on Kingsland Road in May 1939. Sorry, there we go. So this is more than 2,000 seats in the auditorium here, single screen. And something else delightful that I discovered in the Hackney Archives, this is the invitation to the grand opening of the Dalston Odeon. And I still feel they were sort of using this typeface when I started going to the Odeons, in the 80s. So you can see that the invite is addressed to Hackney Councillor F.H. White, personal invitation from Oscar Deutsch. It says, evening dress is optional. I'm afraid we don't know if Councillor White did put on tux for the evening, but we can learn an awful lot about the cinema from the souvenir brochure that guests would have been given, and this is also in the Hackney Archives. Beautiful gold cover. I particularly love this hallmark of luxury entertainment. Oscar Deutsch, very much the face of the business. The slogan, Oscar Deutsch entertains our nation, the letters spelling out Odeon, was used in their advertising a lot. And he might not look it here, but it does say he is an energetic and popular manager. And his wife, very important part of the business. Here she is in the program. It says that Mrs. Oscar Deutsch takes a very active part in the design and arrangement of all artistic matters in connection with Odeon theatres. Mrs. Deutsch's name was Lily, which inevitably meant that Odeon's interiors were often promoted as being gilded by the lily. Boom, boom. Here's the prices. They haven't really changed much more expensive than what I showed you from the 1910s. 6p and 9p in the stalls, up to 2 shillings for the best seats in the circle. And I think it's really always worth remembering, especially in the sort of 1930s, these incredibly beautiful cinemas, that going to the pictures was an affordable luxury for people. Just look how classy the manager, Mr. Bergen, looks. He's the manager of the Dalston Odeon. And I came across the reminiscences of another local called Charles Jenkins, who wrote about his memories of the Hackney Road Odeon. He wrote, each visit was memorable to me. I recall there being a commissaire on duty at the front of the building at all times who was dressed in a chocolate and gold uniform, complete with hat, who readily held doors open for clientele to enter. I also remembered potted palms in the box office area and attractive usherettes who stood at the entrances to the auditorium with torches at the ready to show patrons the way to empty seats. One always felt special going to the Odeon Hackney Road. So World War II had an enormous impact on Hackney, as it did elsewhere in London. This is the Britannia pub next door to the Hackney Empire after it was bombed in 1940. But despite the blackouts and the bombings, London's cinemas only closed very, very briefly during the war. And in 1940, ticket sales in Britain exceeded 1 billion. 1 billion admissions for the first time. Odeon, not the only chain in town. By the 1940s, Odeon's rival ABC had 3 cinemas in Hackney. In 1936, so a few years before the Odeon was built, it had its first cinemas, but it built its first 2 cinemas in the borough. The Regal on Mare Street, this opened in March 1936. And the Savoy on Stoke Newington High Street opened in October 1936. And it's another building that you might recognize. So it closed as a cinema in the 80s, reborn in 2017 as the live events venue Earth. And Hackney's third ABC opened in October 1939, the Ritz, just a little way up the road from where we are now, pretty much next door to the Cinematograph Theatre. So ABC, Associated British Cinemas, was founded in 1927 when this Glaswegian solicitor, John Maxwell, merged 3 smaller Scottish chains into one chain. And unlike Oscar Deutsch, he was also involved in film production. He was a partner in British National Pictures, and that's the company that built Elstree Studios in Boreham Wood in 1925. By 1927, Maxwell controlled all the stock and renamed the company British International Pictures. 1929, they made British film history by producing Blackmail, which the poster proudly proclaims, the first full-length, all-talkie film made in Great Britain. And in 1933, this company they acquired British Pathé, so the newsreel producers, and Maxwell renamed the company Associated British Picture Corporation. So this is an example of what became known as vertical integration, or a combine, basically one company controlling film production, distribution, exhibition, all in one company. When John Maxwell died, age 60, in 1940, his widow, Catherine, sold a large number of shares to Warner Brothers. So Hollywood Studio now becomes the majority owner of the company. Oscar Deutsch, he died of cancer in December 1941, only 48 years old. And Lily, his wife I mentioned earlier, she sold the company to J. Arthur Rank. Rank was the most powerful mogul in the British film industry. He already owned Pinewood Studios, Denham Studios. He owned the Gaumont chain of cinemas, which, like ABC, had a production arm through the form of its sister company, Gainsborough Pictures. Those of you who were here last year for the festival heard me talk about them. And cinema attendance peaks in 1946 with a staggering 1.6 billion tickets sold in this country. And when I meet people on my walking tours who grew up in this sort of post-war period going to the cinema, one of the main memories they talk about is their memories of the Saturday morning pictures. So ABC and Odeon both had their children's clubs. Parents basically can get rid of their kids all morning on Saturday to watch old serials and cartoons. You got a badge. If you were so inclined, you could join in with this jaunty tune. Thank goodness it's fading out. So the clubs even had their own sports teams. I came across a newspaper clipping from 1946 reporting that Dalston Odeon Kingsland Road junior football team beat the Upper Street Odeon a whopping 13-1. So it all sounds very wholesome, doesn't it? With the jaunty songs, the badges, the sports clubs, but proof that there is nothing that can't prompt a great British moral panic. Also, in 1946, there was a debate in the House of Commons, and one MP quoted one of their constituents who was a school teacher saying, "It is quite obvious that on Saturday mornings, most of the work we are trying to do in schools is being destroyed." Again, when I've met people who talk about these Saturday morning clubs, there's a lot of pea shooter action, a lot of low-level violence. It sounds pretty exciting. So cinema going does decline after 1946, but it's all relative. So let me show you this chart. So in 1936, we've got a population in this country of about 40 million, and about 900 million cinema tickets are sold each year. And as we've seen throughout World War II, the cinemas stay open, and then we have this record year in 1946 of 1.6 billion. A decade later, a third of households by this stage have got televisions, but we're still over 1 billion cinema tickets being sold in the country every year. It really tails off in the 1960s and 70s. Cinemas are being converted into more profitable bingo halls, and by 1970, 9 in 10 households have a television. By the 1980s, it gets even worse. So people are watching movies at home on video, but just see, I mean, it's an incredible drop. Sales pick up a little bit in the 90s and the 2000s, so over sort of 100 million tickets sold each year. Then we have COVID, and now today, cinemas are trying to recover when we're very much in this age of streaming. But what I think this chart hopefully shows more than anything else is a change in habits. So we no longer go to the cinema kind of week in, week out, regardless of what's on, which is what people were doing. It's Thursday, I'll go to the pictures. If we go to the cinema at all, it's to see a specific film. And one of the interesting ways to sort of track that trend is through the local newspaper ads for cinemas. So this is July 1953. It might not look it at first glance, but there are 24 different films being advertised over the course of 1 week. So the three major chains, Gaumont, Odeon, ABC, they would never show the same films because they all had different distribution deals. On the same page, 4 more Hackney cinemas are listed, plus 1 in Bethnal Green. 16 different films here. Our friends at the Castle Cinema are showing the brilliant Marlene Dietrich Western Rancho Notorious. And it's also worth mentioning, many of these films are not new releases. So we're before the age of films even on TV, let alone video. Moving forward to 1964, only 1 page of ads. The Gaumonts and the Odeon are now all under the Rank logo. Castle has closed down. And the Kenning Hall, the former Clapton Cinematograph Theatre, is only showing X-rated horror movies. In the early 70s, Hackney Road Odeon has been shut down. Kenning Hall's X-rated fare has moved on from horror to soft porn, the double bill there of Run Virgin Run and the Sex Seekers. And then what's going on at the Tatler? The Tatler down there, the Tatler Cinema Club, uncensored films for members only. And the Tatler on Kingsland Road, that is actually what became the Rio. So we're a few years away from the Rio being what it is today. And finally, 1984, the worst ever year for the UK box office, before or since. Only 45 million tickets sold. And what you see here is fewer ads for specific cinemas, ads for specific films. These Odeons here, they're not Hackney Odeons. These are the Odeons that we still have on Swiss Cottage and Holloway Road. I do want to mention one Hackney cinema that did things its own way in the late 70s and 80s. This is the Astra on Stoke Newington High Street, formerly the Apollo that I showed you earlier. If you can't make out what they're showing, here's a poster. I won't go into why Bruce Lee with an I is playing Bruce Lee with two E's, but for years, this was a kung fu cinema, and kung fu really kept this cinema in business until it closed in the early 80s. So the rise in TV ownership definitely impacted cinema going. Coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, often cited as an impetus for families to buy televisions. But leisure going out was changing too. The stereotype for cinemas closing in the 1960s and 70s was that they were transformed into bingo halls. Basically, prior to the Gambling Act of 1960, you weren't, gambling venues were basically illegal. The change in the law meant that cinema chains had an opportunity, so they would shut down their cinemas and replace them with bingo halls. Even before that, they were doing sort of Sunday afternoon bingo games. And Rank, who owned Odeon and Gaumont, created their own bingo club, Top Rank. So that's the reference. So just 3 years before the Gambling Act was passed, there were more than 14 million bingo club members in the UK. And by 1965, Top Rank's rival Mecca estimated that 150,000 people were playing bingo every day in their halls. Mecca even ran Hackney Empire as a bingo hall from 1963 to 1984. But what was the first cinema that Rank turned into a full-time bingo club? The Odeon on Hackney Road in 1961. This survived as a bingo club until 2015. So the building had 54 years as a bingo club compared to 23 years as a cinema. And the classic 1930 cinema was demolished in 2018. ABC took over the Stamford Hill Cinema in 1948. By then it was called the Super. And if you remember this cinema, this was nearly 1,800 seats all on one level. So absolutely enormous. I'm getting the wrap-up sign, so let me quickly razzle through these. ABC closed it in 1959, and it became not a bingo hall, but Britain's first ever commercial 10-pin bowling alley. 14 lanes. This was very big news.
Opening night of the 10-pin bowling centre introduced a favourite American game to Britain. Everest climber Sir John Hunt was to bowl the first ball. And the celebrities present included heavyweight champ Henry Cooper.
There's more of that on YouTube. The bowling alley was demolished, made way for a supermarket, but proof that even supermarkets have their day. This is a later Sainsbury's, you might know it, on Stamford Hill, closed last year, and there'd been a supermarket on this site since the 80s, built on the site of the former Regent Cinema, which we talked about earlier. By the time it closed in 1972, it was an Odeon. Something else great in the Hackney Archive. It's an amazing campaign, failed campaign, but an amazing campaign all nonetheless to sort of save this cinema. And one of the challenges with saving cinemas like this is they're just too enormous to do anything else with. So I don't think there are any examples in Hackney, but a lot of cinemas around London that do survive have been converted into churches. But what we do have in Hackney is the cinema that I showed you earlier, the Apollo, later the Astra on Stoke Newington High Street. This is it in 1983, so this is the year that it closed as a cinema, and this is what it looks like today. So it's been home of the Azizi Mosque since the mid-80s. So just to wrap up, cinemas that we have in Hackney today all connect with their past in different ways and sort of provide something different for audiences. So the Rio, proudly independent since 1976, shows no sign of changing. If you fancy going tonight, you can go to the Dirty Dykes Film Club. If that doesn't appeal, on 25th of May, as part of this very festival, you can watch this new documentary about the local rabbi, Herschel Gluck. Hackney Picture House opened in 2011, so this occupies the old library, but the other part of the building is the old Central Methodist Hall, which was actually funded by J. Arthur Rank in the 1920s. I mentioned the Curzon Hoxton on the site of the former Hoxton Cinema, which retains the facade. And finally, the remarkable rebirth of the Castle Cinema. Absolutely beautifully restored, also host to events in the Hackney History Festival, and the perfect cinema to finish the talk with. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nigel. We have time for a few quick questions, so if you want to raise your hand, I'll get round with the microphone as quick as I can.
Thank you, Nigel. Fantastic talk. I really enjoyed that. It's not really a memory of a cinema, but I don't know if you know the film Girl Chewing Gum.
I do, and I've seen the clip. And I didn't have time to include it.
Well, I think it might be fun to mention it because it's on YouTube. It was last time I looked. And the full version shows, of course, the Odeon Dalston.
Yeah, it's a Girl Chewing Gum. It's a short film, sort of an experimental film, which is quite postmodern in its own way. It sort of commentates on the sort of the street scene, but has got some wonderful clips of those cinemas. There's another film, the title of which eludes me, from the 50s that also showed what was the Vogue cinema in Stoke Newington. So some of these cinemas are preserved in on film.
I think this chap was just before.
Yeah, I wonder if you could tell us about any cinema organs in any of these cinemas.
Can I tell you about any cinema organs in any of these cinemas? I can't really. Anything specific. I mean, one of the interesting things about cinema organs is that the ones that have survived often move about a lot. So the interesting one, so the Troxy venue that many of you will know, that has the cinema organ in it that works, but it's not originally from the actual theatre.
Hi. My memory of going to the cinema are two things. One was people used to stand up for the Queen, and two, it was always full of smoke. I wondered when those things stopped, if you know.
So smoke, I mean, even when I was a kid, people were smoking in the cinema, and you have this sort of partial, sort of, third of the auditorium is the no smoking area where it just wafts all over. Actually, there's some very amusing footage from the 1960s where I think some Odeon chains experimented with no smoking, and there's some great vox pops you can see of pretty divided. Some people really did like to smoke a lot at the cinema. I don't know actually. I don't know when the national anthem. People weren't standing for the Queen, just, the national anthem would be played, and then people would stand for the Queen. And it probably finished around the same time that they stopped playing the national anthem at the closing of the BBC every night as well, which also happened.
Rather than answering a question, rather than asking, I can answer your question. I worked for the rank organisation from 68 to 75, so the decline of the cinema was not all my fault, but I did do a lot of turning them into bingo clubs. In 1971, Sir Keith Joseph, who was then the Health Secretary, asked our bosses to see if we would have permanent non-smoking areas in cinemas. And as the market researcher, we did the research in a test cinema or two, I don't think one in Hackney, just to see if it was acceptable. Just have a few rows at the front, which would be no smoking. And it is a manifestation of the different world that was. So the question was not whether non-smokers would accept it. The issue revolved around would smokers accept there would be some seats in which they could not smoke.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, even if, we're still, in my memory, smoking on planes, which seems remarkable today. Okay.
My name's Julia Lafferty, and I'm from the Friends of Clapton Cinematograph Theatre. The building is still there, about 5 minutes walk on Lower Clapton Road. Unfortunately, it's been rather badly served by its present owners, who left it empty and going increasingly derelict for a decade. So you can still see it, but I'm afraid it's somewhat lost its charm. In 2013, the Friends of Clapton Cinematograph Theatre decided that we better start to get some of the memories of the people who went to the cinema in the old days. This particular cinema that I'm talking about closed in 1979. So we went around and we got someone called Colin O'Brien, who was a celebrated photographer, to come and do some filming of people who remembered the old cinema and going to it. And the oldest lady we found was born in 1924, Mrs. Glazer. She remembered going to the cinema with her mother about 3 or 4 times a week, and she remembered seeing the Al Jolson film when it was just synchronized with music. But I thought I'd just share with you just a couple of the rather more amusing memories that we got. And I will now put my glasses on to do this. One of them was from Mr. Paul Loftus, and he said, "I have a personal memory of one event at our local Kenning Hall cinema in its heyday. It must have been about 1961. There was a film starring Diana Dawes. For the younger members, she was like England's Marilyn Monroe. And it was advertised she would be making a personal appearance at the cinema for the film's first showing. There we were in the evening with Mum and Dad in the big crowd outside, and the Rolls-Royce drew up, and out she stepped onto the red carpet in her low-cut, glittering gown, and everybody rushed forward for a better view. The flash bulbs from the press cameras popped as the melee ensued. I remember my father fighting his way to the front of the crowd in his flat cap to get a very good view of Miss Dawes, casting my poor mother and me adrift in the... He suffered a week in the doghouse without a word spoken to him for that."
I'm sorry, I think we'll have to wrap up there to turn around for the next event.